My name is David Little, and I'm director of the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is called The Environment as the Moral Challenge of Our Moment. We at the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life are particularly proud to be sponsoring this event. It is hard to deny the urgency of the moral challenge of environmental conservation. That fact, as you may have noticed in this morning's paper, has become particularly dramatic with the fact that President Bush has announced that he has reversed his campaign pledge to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. This act has to be seen as a severe setback to the environmental movement. Almost from its inception in the early 90s, the Center has emphasized the importance of environmental issues. Tim Weiskell, who is here tonight, was associated with the Center for several years and provided dedicated and expert leadership during that time. The Center has expressed its continuing commitment to this matter by inviting Bill McKibben, our initial speaker for this evening, to be one of 4 Center Fellows for this academic year. Bill's presence among us has been a blessing to the Center, to the Divinity School, and to the university. His project this year conforms perfectly to the concerns of the Center, which are to study and think about the intersection among religion, values, and public life. Bill has been investigating what it means, as he puts it, to be heirs of God's increasingly damaged creation, and how people of faith can respond to the global warming crisis. He believes that communities of faith may make a distinctive contribution to the solution of the crisis by pressing underlying questions of human obligation and responsibility. To know Bill McKibben is to know his moral passion for addressing issues of environmental protection. Bill is a rare combination of the prophetic and the pastoral. He is unrelenting in condemning the indifference and the irresponsibility that we see daily around us in face of the crisis before us. In his writings and public statements, he calls leaders and citizens alike to account. But he is also concerned to help find a way out, to address hard questions of policy, and to provide support and guidance to those who are seeking sincerely to transform the patterns of profligacy that have brought us to our present impasse. Bill is a writer and activist who's been a leader in the environmental movement for the past 10 years. He holds a BA from Harvard University and has written a number of books and many articles on the subject before us. Just to mention a few, maybe one, A Personal and Environmental Argument for Smaller Families, published in 1998, The Comforting Whirlwind, God, Job, and the Scale of Creation, and his most famous work, The End of Nature, published in 1989, which has been now translated, according to Bill, into 20 languages, and was reissued in 1999 in a 10th anniversary edition. He's written for The New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, Christian Century, and other magazines. He's an avid hiker, canoeist, and accomplished cross-country skier. He lives with his family for the most part in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, and he's actively involved when he's there with a Sunday school program in a local Methodist church. Bill will speak for about 35 minutes, and then he will be responded to by 2 speakers, we hope by Teresa Heinz, but certainly by the Reverend Robert Massie. We're waiting still for the arrival of Ms. Heinz, and we will cope with that when the time arrives. I think I'll I'll just forego providing an introduction to Ms. Heinz until she gets here. We have arranged to have a backup speaker should she not arrive. So when the time arrives, I will introduce one or the other. Let me say a word about Robert Kinloch Massie. He will respond to Bill McKibben's talk, speaking about 10 minutes or so, as will the other second speaker. Robert Kinloch Massie has been working on issues of corporate government and responsibility for 2 decades. He began working for the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, and he worked for Ralph Nader's Congress Watch. An ordained Episcopal minister, Mr. Massie received his master's degree in social and theological ethics at Yale Divinity School in 1982 and his doctorate in business policy from Harvard Business School in 1989. His research there focused on methods used by large institutional investors to make socially relevant decisions. From 1989 to 96, Mr. Massie taught at Harvard Divinity School, here among us, where he ran the project on business, values, and the economy. In 1993, as a Fulbright scholar, he served for 6 months on the faculty of the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. His book, Loosing the Bonds, The United States and South Africa in the Apartheid Years, was published in '98 by Doubleday and was awarded in the same year the Lionel Gelber Prize for the best book in international relations. In 1994, Mr. Massie ran for lieutenant governor of the state of Massachusetts and won the statewide Democratic primary. Mr. Massie is currently executive director of CERIS, that's the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies, a national coalition of investors, public pension trustees, foundations, labor unions, and environmental, religious, and public interest groups working in partnership with companies to encourage corporate social and environmental responsibility worldwide. We're delighted to have both these gentlemen with us, and we anticipate the arrival of Ms. Heinz. I'm now going to ask Bill McKibben to deliver himself of his remarks, and then we'll proceed as events unfold. Thanks, Bill.
David, thank you for that introduction, most of all for the hospitality of the center this year while I've been here and the Divinity School in general, and also to Tim Weiskell for this tradition of engagement, moral engagement with the environment, which I hope that this school will find ways to continue after I'm no longer here, and I know that it will. Forgive me on 2 counts this afternoon. One is my voice, which has all but vanished today, and in a saner and more sensitive culture, doubtless that would be taken as a sign from the Almighty that one was not to speak at the given moment. Second worse is the flimsiness of my presentation. Now, I tore up what I was going to say yesterday afternoon, and I've been trying to think through a new approach ever since. The reason I did so is obvious to anyone who read the papers this morning. Yesterday afternoon, President Bush sent a letter to the Senate indicating that he decided to make no attempt to put even modest curbs on the emission of carbon dioxide from power plants. It was the most momentous thing he's done since taking office, and time may show it to be the most significant act of his presidency. It ends, I think, one phase of environmental history in this nation, and perhaps, just perhaps, opens the door for another. But before we get there, a bit of context is in order. That context is both scientific and political. I know it'll be old hat to many of you. Excuse me for going over it one more time. First to the science. There are many in this room better qualified to speak than I, and certainly at this university. But here is a short recap of what we know right now about global warming, about climate change, about the largest threat, the largest change on this planet, not only in human history, but for a lot of history before that. In 1989, when I wrote The End of Nature, global warming was still a hypothesis. I thought it was a strong hypothesis, but it was clearly a hypothesis, and it needed a lot of study and examination. That happened. the scientific method, working with its powerful dialectic, managed within about 5 years to begin churning out workable answers about what happens when human beings burn huge amounts of fossil fuel and put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide that, by virtue of its molecular structure, traps heat near the planet that would otherwise radiate back out to space. By 1995, those scientists were able to say that we were heating up the planet and that that heat might cause real and significant damage as we went into the future. That was an important understanding, one that since then has strengthened and darkened. This same grouping of scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, delivered their second 5-year assessment in Shanghai last month. What they said was that in the course of this century, human beings would heat the planet from 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Excuse me. We've just begun. That we would heat the planet 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the course of this century, with a worst-case scenario of about 11 degrees. Those numbers are much larger than the numbers we were using in 1989 or even a few years ago. As our understanding has grown, the diagnosis has gotten worse. Beyond that, what's happened in the last 5 years is as if the planet itself had begun to peer review the scientific literature. We've seen 8 of the 10 warmest years on record in the last decade. We've seen a temperature increase of about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit globally. That doesn't sound like much, but it turns out to be enough to change things in very remarkable ways. Ways that we really hadn't understood even in the 1980s. Consider hydrology, for instance. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air. If you increase the temperature, then you begin in arid areas to evaporate more water, and you have more drought proneness, precisely what we've begun to see. That water, once it's in the atmosphere, falls someplace else. We see greater deluge and greater flood, and again, those things are demonstrably on the increase around the world. Look at the frozen parts of our planet, and we have one of the great experts on those frozen parts of the planet here at Harvard, and in fact here in the audience today, Jim McCarthy. Even 10 or 11 years ago, people understood or thought that the sort of melting of the cryosphere would take place fairly gradually. Turns out we have good data about things like Arctic ice. We have good data because we ran nuclear submarines underneath the Arctic ice pack for a very long time and collected data about what we were going under. That data was released about a year ago, and it showed conclusively that across the Arctic, the ice is about 40% thinner than it was 40 years ago. That's an enormous change. 40% thinner. Every major glacial system in the world, with 1 or 2 exceptions, is in retreat and in rapid retreat. You all saw the story on the front of the Times a couple of weeks ago, indicating that the snows of Kilimanjaro would be the bare rocks of Kilimanjaro by 2015 or something like that. Glacier National Park will have no glaciers by 2030. One could list changes like these to the hydrological cycle and to the cryosphere. You could go on and on down this list for 2 hours and listing nothing more than what these kind of first-order, large magnitude, really enormous changes. Suffice it to say that we live on a different planet than we used to live on. Those pictures that people took from outer space in 1969 that were so famous, they are of a different planet than the Earth we now inhabit. It has changed in substantial and significant ways. Its glaciers, its ice, its sea level, its areas of forest and desert. And it will change enormously much more in the course of this century unless we do very dramatic things. So, can we do those things? I said earlier that the scientific method had worked with tremendous power to understand this problem. The political method has failed with somewhat of the same power to do anything about these questions, failed about as spectacularly as the scientific method has succeeded. George Bush the Elder when he was president in 1988, when he was running for president, and people were worried about global warming, George Bush the elder said that he was going to combat the greenhouse effect with the White House effect upon his election. This is not something that he probably really meant, but at least there was enough political heat, so to speak, on this issue that he felt forced to say that. And forced again in 1992, when he was running for re-election and went to the Rio summit on the environment, felt forced then to say that in the course of the 1990s, that by the year 2000, America would emit no more carbon dioxide than it had in 1990. In other words, that we would do the work in the decade of the 1990s to sort of turn this ocean liner around, to do the work of putting in place the transition to a new energy system not as dependent on cheap fossil fuels that would allow us to prosper without vast emissions of carbon dioxide. Bill Clinton repeated that pledge within weeks of taking office and continued to talk a good game on these issues for 8 years. He continued not only to talk a good game, he continued to do nothing about them for that same 8 years. As a result, last year, the year 2000, Americans emitted 12% more carbon dioxide than they did in the year 1990. Far from turning the ocean liner around, we kept sailing in pretty much the same direction. The final coda to that attempt to deal or not deal with this problem came in The Hague in November, when the countries of the world assembled in an effort to cross the T's and dot the I's on the so-called Kyoto Treaty, the first attempt to have some kind of international control on carbon dioxide gases. We sent a low-level delegation. That low-level delegation refused to deal seriously with the issue of America's fossil fuel consumption, instead insisting on a wide variety of loopholes to allow us to theoretically meet treaty obligations without any serious changes in our energy infrastructure. As a result, the rest of the world finally said enough and walked away, calling our bluff, and the entire situation collapsed. There is now no serious international effort underway. The hopes of reviving the Kyoto Accords seem, at the moment, mere hopes, and much more only hopes today. There was a brief moment at the beginning of this second Bush administration when environmentalists were trying to convince themselves that it might not be so bad. There was a sort of Nixon goes to China scenario that one heard a lot about. Man came from the oil industry and was going to be able to take us in new directions and so on and so forth. In fact, last Saturday, the New York Times had a very hopeful article about how Bush had decided to regulate carbon dioxide as one of the 4 pollutants emerging from power plants, and this would be a good first step. And Christy Todd Whitman, the new secretary of the EPA, had gone off to meet with the European environment ministers and pledged this same thing. And there were a few conciliatory quotes from environmental leaders, and all looked as if perhaps there was a brief moment of opening. But no, this administration is owned by other people. Yesterday, in his letter to the Senate, Bush specifically repudiated a campaign pledge, saying that that pledge had been a mistake. He wrote, "At a time when California has already experienced energy shortages and other Western states are worried about price and availability of energy this summer, we must be very careful not to take actions that could harm consumers." Here's the rub. This didn't happen because Bush has not been thoroughly convinced about global warming being a problem. It happened because neither he nor anyone else in a leadership role has yet to feel that they could get away with asking even the mildest sacrifice from any of us. Proof of that, you need only to look at what Al Gore did in the fall campaign. Here's a politician who knows more about climate change than any politician in the world, understands it deeply and cares about it, I believe, deeply. When the price of gasoline began to go up in the course of the summer, he responded by demanding that the country open its strategic petroleum reserve to flood the market with oil and bring the price of gasoline back down. He did that because he understood that he could not be elected otherwise, that we would not, in large numbers, allow that to happen. The only answers, therefore, that so far have even been entertained are the most hidden technocratic ones: a forest of loopholes for the Kyoto Treaty, the partnership for a new generation vehicle with Detroit that may someday yield a handful of higher mileage cars, so forth and so on. In other words, though the real heat of global warming can already be measured, there is no political heat at all. It might as well not exist as a public issue. And now I'll be even more frank with you. Given that lack of public interest on the issue, it's just as well that Bush didn't decide to do anything on power plant emissions. Just as well that the Kyoto Treaty seems destined to die, because those steps are very, very small. The scientists tell us that we need 60 to 80% reductions in fossil fuel use immediately in order even to stabilize climate at current levels of disruption. The reductions under those kind of plans that we've talked about so far are so tiny that only if they're done in enormous good faith as the first jogging steps before we break into a sprint will they amount to anything. And if they were adopted at this moment, they would merely serve as a screen to keep us from worrying about this problem for another administration or another decade or another whatever. And we don't have 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, whatever, to go on ignoring this issue. No. We need to do the work that we haven't done in the past of engaging this question as more than a technical and policy challenge, of recognizing it for what it is, the great moral question of this moment, as great as the civil rights movement was in the 1960s. Backtrack for a minute to another context, more important. Let's talk for a minute about the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, which the rabbis and the theologians have often referred to as enigmatic and hard to understand and sort of strange. It doesn't fit in with anything else. It's not actually hard to understand. You just couldn't make sense of it properly until the late 20th century, until our few moments on this earth when we began to take over the world around us. You know the story. Many of you know it far better than I do. Job is a good man. Suddenly, bad things start to happen to him. His family dies, his cattle die, he ends up living on a dung heap at the edge of town covered with oozing sores. He can't understand this in the logic of his time because he's been a good man. So he demands an interview with God. And at the end of the book, God, as you know, appears, speaking from a whirlwind. In fact, I think, and people here can correct me easily, I think it's the longest sustained speech that God gives anywhere in the Bible at all. And it's a wonderful, powerful, amazing, sarcastic speech. Basically, God taunts Job. Where were you when I set the boundaries of the oceans and told the proud waves, here you shall break and no further? Do you know where I store the wind? Do you know where I keep the thunderstorm? Can you whistle and the clouds will answer? What is so hard about that? He's telling Job, you're not the center of the world. There's more in it than you can imagine. Your sense of justice and entitlement does not drive it. It does not revolve around you. But God tells him something else, too. It's a beautiful world, full of solace and meaning and glory. He tells about the ostrich and the warhorse, redeemed by sheer speed, of the vulture looking for carrion. Who feeds the lion cubs when they're hungry? Of the antelope, giving birth, pressing, panting. She gives birth. Her young grow strong in the wilds. They leave and do not return. Job falls silent. Nothing he can say to this. And why would he want to? There's solace enough here for him to be part of God's creation, beauty enough in the company of the rest of creation, in the company of other people, as part of something larger. In a way, that's why the commentators could never make sense of it. Of course God was bigger than we were. Of course we couldn't tell the waves where to break. Of course we weren't at the absolute center of things. But now, all of a sudden, we are at the center of things. Forget about it, God. We tell the waves where to break now. We're going to raise the sea level an easy foot or two in the course of this century. That's mostly not because of those melting glaciers. It's because warm water takes up more space than cold water. That thermal expansion will be enough to raise the ocean a foot. A foot is a lot. If your beach slopes inward at a 1-degree angle, like most beaches on the eastern seaboard, that brings the water in 90 feet. We tell the waves where to break now. Who tells the storm to come? Deluges, severe storms that drop more than 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period have increased 20% across this hemisphere over the baseline. That's a huge increase. Basic physical phenomena like that aren't supposed to change 20% in the course of a decade or two. Partly, we've evolved to this central position by accident. We didn't really know what we were doing to the planet until quite recently. You can't blame our parents for driving big cars, I suppose. We still seemed small. But partly, we've gotten to this place very much on purpose. Our consumer society has exceeded the bound of all reason. I say this with some mild authority, having once written an odd book called The Age of Missing Information. This was a bizarre experiment. I found the largest cable TV system on Earth. It had 100 channels. I got people who lived in this town where they were lucky enough to have this to tape for me everything that came across these 100 channels for 24 hours. I had 2,400 hours worth of television. I took it back home to the Adirondacks. I spent a year watching it. That was my Richard Simmons and I were best friends for. There were a lot of insights you could garner from that enterprise, a lot of ideas about time and history and how we view each other and so on. But if you boiled it all down, if you took all that sap and made syrup of it, what you would come out with is this thought. You are the most important thing on Earth. You sitting there with the remote control in your hand are the heaviest object in the universe, and everything should revolve around you, and that's it. This bud's for you. With that in mind, are you surprised that Al Gore wanted to open the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Surprised that George Bush can figure the price of a kilowatt hour more easily than he can judge the value of a planet? And it's beyond sort of simple preference. It's evolved into a kind of gimcrack machine that under the current logic simply can't be stopped. Consider Paul ONeill, now Treasury Secretary, former head of Alcoa, who, according to those who know him, actually understands a great deal of the danger of global warming, who in fact in a speech 3 years ago compared it to the threat of a nuclear holocaust, but who has confined himself in the Bush administration to arguing for a tax cut. Why does he want a tax cut? Because it will, quote, put more money back into the hands of people who will buy homes and cars and bigger homes and bigger cars. That's what we have been reduced to as a people and a nation. It's the economy, stupid. Bigger homes and bigger cars. How the hell much bigger are they planning to make them? It is time to say that this is not a technical issue at heart, not a policy issue, but an issue of who we are. The biggest practical test we've ever had to confront, precisely because it raises this most essential of religious and moral questions. Are you the most important thing in the universe? Is your comfort, convenience, security the most important thing, or is something else more important? It's a moral issue if you think other people matter, especially poor and marginalized people. We've never figured out a way, though God knows we've tried, to make the lives of poor people around the world more precarious than by raising the temperature of the planet. I spent much of the summer in Bangladesh, a beautiful, vibrant country. Only big problem with Bangladesh is that it's low to the Bay of Bengal. If you raise the sea level there even a few inches, then the water flooding down out of the Himalaya and the Ganges and the Brahmaputra runs into that higher Bay of Bengal and backs up across Bangladesh. That's what happened in 1998 when for a period of about 3 months, 2/3 of the country was in thigh-deep water. They survived. They survived far better than any of us would survive 90 days in thigh-deep water. They're an adaptable people, but they weren't food self-sufficient that year because they couldn't plant a fall rice crop, and they can't survive year after year after year of that, which any credible scenario that doesn't involve real change here quickly will entail for them. And Bangladesh is just one of a dozen or many more examples. It's a moral issue if you think that the rest of creation counts. One image that's lingered in my mind this year that I've said several times when I've been talking to people here, one of the things that, one of the most beautiful spots in the world for me are the coral reefs of the tropics. I'm sure many of you have been there to dive in those reefs. They're one of the most enchanting corners of God's brain that there is. You're down there in this amazing place, and the rest of the animals there don't even really care that you're there. You know, they're just swim slightly out of their way to avoid you, but there you. By 2050, according to most of the research, there may be no coral reefs left, okay? As you warm the water, you kill the small animals that produce that coral. You bleach that coral reef. Already happening in all sorts of places, and seems, according to the researchers, likely only to accelerate. Head up to the far north. Look at the polar bears. The absolutely opposite other end of creation. They don't care about us either, except as a kind of, you know, dinner. The absolute incarnation of the other, you know, as tough and magnificent as you can imagine. Polar bears in one study last year were found to be about 20% skinnier than they had been a decade before. Why are they skinnier? Because polar bears have evolved to hunt seals on pack ice. If you melt the pack ice, then it gets hard to hunt the seals. Polar bears may well not survive outside of zoos some decades hence. And the reef fish and the polar bears are just two examples in an enormous, endless cascade of extinctions that we can expect. It's a moral issue, finally, if you think the future has some call on us. We have never figured out a more profound way to strip mine the future, to alter and degrade the conditions for everyone who will have to come after us for all the generations that stretch on into eternity. If this had been done to us a few generations ago, we would loathe the people who did it. We would consider them in our histories the most irresponsible, most short-sighted, most loathsome of our ancestors. That may well be how we're apprehended sometime in the future. This is what climate change is for us here and now, and not a practical issue of immediate self-interest. We are rich enough at this latitude to ride out the changes that the next few decades will bring. By the time it pinches us so directly that we feel moved to do something about it for that reason, it may well be too late to do much about it. It is an issue of who we are, one that has never been raised so directly at any time in human history. We need to answer it in some full way, not with a backdoor regulation on power plant emissions, but with a growing willingness to pay more for energy, to use less energy, to find new and humane sources of energy. Not with a treaty that will be searched for loopholes and soon forgotten, but with an open-hearted commitment to spreading decent lives and livelihoods around the planet so that people don't copy our own hyper-individualistic consumerism. Not with a new engine, or not with a new engine alone, but with a new heart. And if we cannot muster that, then what we will do won't matter. It won't be enough, and we'll still be vulnerable to the even greater environmental challenges coming down the road. For instance, the consumerist call to genetically re-engineer our own bodies to put our very humanness behind us. Such transformation will not be easy, but it is not impossible. We have just finished a century that saw the massed victims of colonialism non-violently assert their personhood and take control of their lives, that saw some racists change their souls or at least their actions, that saw the cowed people of an entire arc of Europe shake off Stalinism. Our task will be harder, for we need to modify attitudes and habits that seem to have benefited us. But it too is possible. It needs to begin, though. We need a new, much broader environmentalism that draws, among other things, on the churches and synagogues and mosques as the moral batteries of this work. As the only institutions, imperfect as they are, left in our society that can credibly posit some goal other than accumulation for human existence. As the only institutions left that are able to say with a straight face, it's not the economy, stupid. It's all sorts of other things that really matter. And as we begin this work, as we try to ramp up and amp up and charge up this work so that it really gets going, we need symbols. Just as Gandhi had a pinch of salt and Rosa Parks had the seat of a bus, we need ways to think about this in concrete terms. There are many, many concrete ways in which all of us contribute to this problem, and any one of them would make a fit example. Our ever bigger houses, our penchant for jumping on planes, all of that. Let me nominate one for you today as a good, useful symbol. That would be the sport utility vehicle. A good symbol in part because it does real damage. The statistic that sticks in my mind is this. If you drive a normal American car, okay, and you go trade it in for one of the big SUVs, and drive that big SUV for 1 year, the differential in the amount of energy you use, and hence the amount of carbon dioxide you produce, is the equivalent of opening your refrigerator door and leaving it open for 6 years. Okay? That's a long time. Not only does it do real damage, it's real pointless. We know that it's real pointless because we all got around without them for a very long time. I grew up in Lexington, not far from here. Always a prosperous suburb, at least in my time. When I visited the Stop and Shop in Lexington recently, the only conclusion that a rational person could draw from looking at the parking lot of the Stop and Shop was that there were 3 or 4 wild rivers between the homes of most Lexingtonians and the supermarket. Things that required 18 inches of clearance and 4-wheel drive to get there. You took your life in your own hands because nobody could see to backing up. They're sort of, you're backing into things. My daughter, Sophie, who is a wonderful observer, we were driving the other day, and she's looking out the window of our Honda Civic, and she said, look, Dad, there's a new SUV. And indeed, pulled up next to us, there was a Brinks truck. And it's absolutely right. That's clearly the next generation of these things, and you, smarter than I, you'd go off and, open the factory to make them. I don't know what can be done about SUVs, but I know that something must be done. I just wrote an article that I think is in the current issue of Christian Century called "Can a Good Christian Buy an SUV?" in 2001. Somehow, we've got to change the valence on SUVs and on a lot of other things, so that instead of seeming attractive and cool, and in fact, as a way of communing with nature, which is how, in large measure, they managed to sell them to people, they're seen as just the opposite. In somewhat the same way that people, through all sorts of work and action, managed to change the valence of, say, a segregated country club sometime between 1957 and 1967. In 1957, well, that's just where you went. If you were white and you lived in that area, well, that's where everybody went. That's where the pool was. That's where the business contacts were. By 1967, well, maybe if you're going to do that, you had to think about it in a very different way. Maybe it wasn't quite so cool. Somehow that same work has to happen. When the snow melts, some of us are going to try. If you want to, we'll pass around a sheet. If you want to put down your email address, I'm happy to let you know. We're going to try to go out some Saturday mornings, out to the automobile dealerships. Those of you who grew up here remember Ernie Bach on television, yes? Come on down. We're going to come on down to the, Norwood Auto Mile. We'll be peaceful and good-humored and eager to recommend that people try the new Honda Insight. It's 70 miles to a gallon. Now, there's a cool car, and if you can't ride a bicycle or a bus, it's the next best thing to doing it. Hopeful, anyway, of going there and many other places and changing people, ourselves included, in some real way. If that happens, so that we can imagine some purpose for ourselves and our nation other than bigger houses and bigger cars, then George Bush did us a real favor yesterday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. That was deeply, deeply impressive. I think I'll ask Bob Massie to go ahead now, and then after he's through, I'll introduce Ms. Heinz, and she can make her comments at that time. Bob.
Okay, thank you, Bill. That was tremendous. And my problem is there's so much great stuff to talk about, so little time. But I'd like to think that we are launching a new conversation, new form of commitment, new energy, and all kinds of new activities. And we can talk about that in our discussion. We can talk about that at the reception. I'll come back. We can do whatever you like. But I want to offer a word of caution right from the beginning, which is that we have seen some efforts in the past that have not really gotten off the ground. So sometimes we think, oh boy, okay, we're really going to get it done this time. But things have been tried. I mean, I remember going to a meeting at the Kennedy School in 1988 that was helping to inaugurate Project 88, which was a program that Senator John Heinz and Senator Tim Wirth were getting off the ground. And there was really an expectation, Teresa, that this was going to be a whole new approach and unleash a wave of new activity. And although the approach itself has been tried and proven, it has not quite caught on in the way that everyone anticipated. Or in 1991, I remember going to St. John the Divine and listening to Tim Wirth and Al Gore and Carl Sagan, who had convened some leading scientists on climate change and on the ozone hole and so forth, and brought together religious leaders from around the country in order to try to persuade them to take some leadership on this issue. And it was a very moving and exciting moment, and that was in 1991, 10 years ago. Somehow the religious leaders were not really able to incorporate that into their vision of their own role in as leaders. 1992, thanks to Tim Weiskell and many other people here at Harvard Divinity School, we organized an incredible event, I think not since duplicated, sadly, which was essentially a religious service in the IMAX Theater of the Boston Museum of Science. And we had we showed the film, The Blue Planet, and we talked about religious education. It was called The Renewal of Reverence, Theological Education in the Environmental Era, and that was 9 years ago. And some things have happened, but not enough. We've gone through, as you've heard, the efforts to try and move the international community forward in the Kyoto Treaty, and on and on and on. And there's a lot of blame to go around. Bill did a brilliant job of identifying some. I want to focus my comments in a sort of pointed fashion on religious communities, because I agree with Bill that there's been a spectacular, embarrassing, humiliating failure on the part of religious communities to take this on as a challenge. I'd like to speak as a Christian and as a clergyman in the Episcopal Church, because I think it's important that I explain to you a little bit from my own faith perspective. But this applies. I mean, I can be quite liberal with my criticism, and I also should just say that the criticism isn't just meant to spew out all over everyone else. It's meant to help us to focus in this season of Lent a little bit on our own behavior and what specific actions we might take. So in the Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopal Church, there's a Eucharistic prayer C, which makes reference for the first time really to the fragility of the earth, and talks about this fragile earth, our island home. It's kind of a beautiful phrase. And yet, though this is now part of the Eucharistic liturgy, we have not been able to engage with the fact that this fragile earth, our island home, is actually being destroyed. It's really an amazing concept. And I think in a discussion we can talk about these issues of impending despair and denial that can creep in, and the spiritual tools that we can use to combat it. But that's the truth. This fragile earth, our island home, is being destroyed. Now, Bill talked about the silence, the pathetic silence that we've had from most of our political leaders. I thought Tom Friedman's piece recently about the desire to drill in the cathedral, drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in order to obtain 6 months of worth of oil supply for the United States was a very apt criticism. But there's no huge public rebellion. If you think about what $1 trillion could do to create new incentives or to help people all over the world to make the shift to renewable energy, think about what $1 trillion could do. And what are we talking about doing with that $1 trillion? We are talking about returning that $1 trillion to us so that we, who already consume more than anyone else in the world, can buy more stuff. I mean, it's an unbelievable act of moral cowardice. In the aftermath of World War II, when this country didn't have that much and was exhausted from having fought a huge military battle, we were able to find money to give to our enemies. And it was money that we really didn't have because we understood that our well-being in the long term depended on assisting others. And we gave that money, but now the only thing that we can think of doing with these cascading oceans of cash, unbelievable amount of money, is to give it back to ourselves. We also don't hear much from our business leaders, although I would make the case that, in fact, we're starting to hear more from business leaders than we are from religious leaders. But we don't hear much from the majority of business leaders, partly because the system is structured to focus on short-term returns. And I actually think a case can be made, and I think we at Harvard ought to start making it, that trustees of companies and trustees of large pension funds and others are actually violating their long-term fiduciary duty by failing to reflect on the implications of the single largest transition in human planetary existence, the implications of that for their investments and for their leadership of their respective institutions. I think we should make that case, not on the angle that well, maybe if you do more environmental stuff, you can make a little more money. No, I think we should challenge the basic concept of being a fiduciary. But let me now say a few things about the religious community. Religious communities are witnessing the systematic desecration of God's world, the potential extermination of God's children, especially children of the poor, and yet our leaders of all kinds, seminary leaders, bishops, clergy, lay leaders, you name it, they have nothing bold or useful to say. Now, I know there are programs and things going on, but really in comparison to the magnitude of the problem, in comparison to the urgency of the problem, these are tiny little burps that are happening from the institution. Nothing of the scope or scale that is required. And the irony of this is that certainly in the Christian church, we applaud the ancient martyrs of the church. We extol those who had the wisdom to oppose slavery. And we look back with considerable nostalgia on those who fought for civil rights. But in our own day and age, I think that our religious communities are as limp and self-satisfied and complicit as any of the religious hypocrites we find it so easy to condemn now. Now, I'm reminded, David mentioned that I did some work on South Africa. I'm reminded of the wonderful phrase of Trevor Huddleston, who was an Anglican pastor in Soweto, who wrote a book called Not for Your Comfort about apartheid. And he said, with regard to racial justice, he said, the church is asleep, though sometimes it talks in its sleep. Now, one of the things in Christian theology, we're very quick to talk about how the theology of incarnation means that we as human beings share in the privilege and connection to divinity, but we very, very rarely talk about the responsibility that goes with that. And yet the basic story of Scripture, the Hebrew Bible and of Christian Scripture, is that God reaches out to flawed human beings, flawed, sinful, proud, useless, busy human beings, and asks them to take on a role in leading change, in doing something extraordinary. And the remarkable thing, if you look at Scripture, is the consistency of the pattern where human beings, hearing that call, say no. They say, we're sinful, broken, useless, busy, find somebody else. Isaiah says it. Moses says it, Peter says it, Jonah says it. Jonah, wonderful case, God says, go to Nineveh, preach against the great city of Nineveh in the east. God says, and takes a boat to the west. And that's why God has to send the whale to go get Jonah to bring Jonah back to do the job. So the point is that the great religious traditions teach that it isn't somebody else who's called to act in each generation. It is us in all our failure, in all our weakness. Now, specifically, this isn't just a call to take a lot of specific steps, although the specific steps are important. I think one of the great failures is not just to find voice, but to tap the thousands of years of religious practice, which would allow us to enter into something that's so immense, so frightening, that most of us, when we look at it, we just go, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to go buy an SUV. And that element of despair, or a kind of sanctimonious scale of well, at least I'm better than someone else. You know, I don't drive an SUV. At least I'm better than the SUV people. Or at least I'm a vegetarian, or at least I recycle. And so there's a long tradition of finding a tiny way to feel better than someone else, and therefore absolving yourself. I mean, that's a deep tradition. So we need to find spiritual practices at all levels of the problem. I was at Yale last Friday at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and most of the time people were talking about, well, is it better to do this or that? Or should we try this approach or that approach? And the answer is we must do everything at all scales. And that's great, because we all have different skills. And that is, I think, the key for religious communities, is to help people find ways to act as persons in their homes. Not just say grace at meals, but to say a little prayer of contrition when you take out the garbage. Not just to have a liturgy that mentions Scripture, it mentions the environmental problems, but to build whole liturgies of repentance and renewal around that. Not just to have private expressions of commitment and faith, but public. I totally agree with this idea, and I have some of going to the SUV. I'd love to come with you, and I'd love to offer some suggestions about how we could make it truly effective. Because ultimately, if we don't if we're just praying and acting inside little closed houses and religious communities, then we're not going to have any impact. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, silence is acquiescence. And one of the things that is most obvious when you look at this sad and sorry tale is that people outside religious communities assume that the silence of the religious communities means that there is not a problem. I mean, how can we expect other people to act and take this seriously and put themselves on the line if religious communities, including seminaries, are not willing to do that themselves? So, just to wrap up, because I know that there's so much to talk about, just tell you very little bit about what I do and since I left Harvard Divinity School, because I want to give you a word of hope. There's a lot of things going on. There are many things that you can do. Two quick things just very practically. First of all, when I left Harvard Divinity School, I went to work for an organization called Ceres, which you heard about. It's a big coalition of investors and national environmental groups, and we are engaging with companies directly. You can find out all about it at www.ceres.org, and there's ways that you can get involved, find out more. And as I say, the good news is that some people are really listening and really acting. And one of the things that we learned, by the way, I want to say that there's some wonderful people from Ceres. I'm really pleased to see so many of my colleagues here. Ceres folks, will you just wave your hands so that, yeah. So if you want to talk about Ceres and what we're doing and learn more, those are the folks to see. But one of the things that we realized in an era of globalization, in an era of expanded information, transparency, the idea of disclosure, of measuring what people are doing and releasing that information, that drives behavior. And so we have launched a huge international project called the Global Reporting Initiative, which is to set environmental and social disclosure standards for big companies worldwide. And we're working on that with the UN Environment Program and with hundreds of other organizations so that people will have to report on their sustainability performance in the same way that they have to report on their financial performance. And there's a lot of wonderful work being done about that. So finally, I just want to say, repeat something that Bill said. We talk a great game as Americans in places like Harvard Divinity School. We talk about solidarity with the poor. We talk about understanding what's going on in the world. We don't understand what's going on in the world. We are disconnected from it. And I have been on 4 of the world, all right. I've been on 4 of the world's 6 continents in the last few months. I've asked all kinds of people from all kinds of settings, what can we do that will most assist you? They say, change the behavior of your own country. I mean, that's really what we're called to do. And that because without the United States and without our outrage and without our leadership, we cannot expect of people of Bangladesh to suddenly rise up and change the American auto industry. It's not going to happen. It has to depend on us. So ultimately, we think this is something that might affect us in the future, and maybe we'll deal with it then. But the people of Mexico, of Honduras, of Kenya, Mozambique, China, the Pacific Islands, they're feeling it right now. This is not a future problem that we ought to worry about at some point. This is a real problem that's unfolding right now. And I just want to say to you, as in conclusion, I want to say to you that every single person here can find their center of gravity. If you can do a little bit and a little way and go to one thing, that's enough. If you can do more, do that. Be called into it from wherever you are. That's the lesson of great movements, is not to suddenly become a different human being. It's to be who you are, where you are, and have the impact that you can have, which I can tell you, having been involved in all kinds of activist movements all my life, you can have a huge impact as long as you don't listen to those who say, you know, that's never really going to happen. The answer is it can happen. It already is beginning to happen, but we have to have the outrage, the passion, and the commitment. And I think Harvard Divinity School has a special obligation, and we should not lose that opportunity here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for those rousing comments. Let me introduce now Ms. Teresa Heinz, who has joined us. We're very, very grateful that she's here. She has a very interesting background, and I think it's relevant to what we're saying tonight, so let me take a minute or two to sketch that out. Teresa Heinz is chair of the Heinz Family Philanthropies and the Howard Heinz Endowment, which are considered among the nation's most innovative philanthropic institutions. She is also the creator of the prestigious Heinz Awards, an annual program recognizing outstanding vision and achievement in the arts, public policy, technology, and the economy, the environment, and the human condition. Following the death of her husband, U.S. Senator John Heinz, in 1991, Teresa Heinz was urged by national and Pennsylvania political leaders to seek election to his Senate seat. She chose instead to assume direction of the family's extensive philanthropic operations, undertaking a major reorganization designed to sharpen the foundation's strategic focus. After only 2 years, the Chronicle of Philanthropy concluded that her efforts had left the Heinz endowments poised to become much more influential as a force in the philanthropic world. Today, the foundations she oversees are widely known for developing innovative strategies to protect the environment, improve education, enhance the lives of young children, broaden economic opportunity, and promote the arts. Heralded by the ONeill Reader in 1995 as one of 100 visionaries to watch, Teresa Heinz has long been recognized as one of the nation's premier environmental leaders. In 1995, she announced one of the largest grants ever made to the environment, a $20 million gift to create the H. John Heinz III Center for Science, Economics, and Environment, a unique attempt to bring together representatives of business, government, the scientific and environmental communities to collaborate on the development of mutually acceptable yet scientifically sound environmental policies. In addition to serving on the center's board, she is vice chair of environmental defense and a member of Harvard University's Center for International Development. She has endowed a professorship in environmental management at the Harvard Business School and a chair in environmental policy at the Kennedy School of Government. Since 1995, she has sponsored conferences on women's health and environment, bringing together women with health, environmental, and policy experts to to learn how the environment impacts on their daily lives and indicate steps that every woman can take to improve conditions. Finally, Teresa Heinz was born and raised in Mozambique. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Romance Languages and Literature from the University of Witwatersrand, is that right? Something like that, in Johannesburg, South Africa. In 1963, she graduated from the Interpreter School of the University of Geneva. Fluent in 5 languages, she later served as a full-time consultant to the United Nations trusteeship in New York City. It's with great appreciation that I welcome Ms. Heinz to our gathering this evening.
Thank you. Well, I'm not an author, and I'm not a religious leader, so I don't know why I'm here. But maybe because I'm a person, and I think that's important too. I've been trying to figure out how to do this. I'm not usually, I usually give speeches and answer questions. This is a different exercise. So I thought probably I would talk a little bit about how I think and then respond to you instead of doing the other way around. And I've been reading up some of your wonderful writings, and I know Bobby Massie well. And not knowing exactly what was going to be said, I kind of put bullets down. I shot in the dark. But anyway, I just want to tell you how I think about the environment and what brought me to where I am, because that can happen to any of us. It's not a formal bringing about, it's a growing into it. And we all have those trigger points in our lives that remind us looking back or that propel us going forward. So what I really would like to talk about is the nature of this moral obligation, and moral is really a core word here that we have towards the environment. And the point I want to make is that this obligation is not solely that of a steward in charge. And I agree with your notion of stewardship, but typically when we think of stewards, we think of authority figures standing astride that for which they have responsibility. Stewards are in control. We're in a mess. They're the boss. What they say goes. Our relationship with the environment is much more complicated than that. And our failure to remember that is precisely where we find ourselves in trouble in the world today. I believe the fundamental mistake that we as a society make with regard to the environment is to continue to see it as somehow separate from ourselves. We speak of a relationship with the environment in the same way that we might speak of a relationship between two people. Relationships, as we use that word in the West, are optional, very often contractual. You can break them. You can have them or not have them. But in the case of the environment, the relationship is between us and the natural system of which we are a part. There is nothing optional about this relationship. It can be good or bad, but what it absolutely cannot be is irrelevant. It is a relationship in the essence with ourselves. And I learned that as a young girl growing up in Mozambique. And I lived there till I was 21. I came to care about the environment, not through movement, but if you forgive the pun, naturally. It was a way of staying healthy, staying alive, having fun. I was a child. Lived on trees a lot of the time, played piano, the rest. And this was long before the big E word came into fashion, or indeed before it even had the present connotations. Simply said, if one lived in any tropical climate, in Africa or elsewhere, one learned that there were rules and guiding principles one had to follow and respect, if for no other reason to stay alive. Initially, that was because you might get a boxed ear from your parents, and I did get some of those. But then, and much more interestingly, it was because you realized, in the words of Stephen King, a novel a couple of years ago, that the world had teeth. There was an order to things, relationships between cause and effect, and if you understood them, you could learn when to swim without being eaten by sharks or attacked by crocodiles. You could learn to avoid illnesses. That's how I learned about disease, and my father was a physician, and luckily for me, he took me on rounds. The rainy season meant mosquitoes, malaria, quinine shots, which really hurt, they burnt, or quinine pills, which was so bitter, and I was little, I used to have to take those, and paludrin after that, not so bad. It meant drinking and boiling water. It meant washing vegetables with permanganate and other things. It meant putting iodine in rice we're in the bush to help with dysentery. It meant all kinds of things. It was reality. And of course, God forbid there should be epidemics. So you stayed alive because you were smart. You knew how to behave yourself and you knew how to live with nature. These were the days before antibiotics too. I'm that old. In those days, there was no choice but to live wisely, with nature. No one attacked harmony with the environment as some warm and fuzzy New Age type of concept. It was life and death. In the West, we have confused our capacity to control and even to destroy nature as a mastery of it. And you can go back and look at the Bierstadts and the Frederick churches and all the wonderful paintings of the 18th century. Man in awe of nature. And then, in the sense, your SUV is a great control of nature. If you get it, you can climb anything. Mind you, I used some of those cars in Africa when we did have to go places where there were no roads. But they weren't SUVs, but they were something like it. But most of us don't live in Africa, in the bush. So good stewardship becomes just another choice we can make, the option of the morally enlightened. But real mastery, as opposed to stewardship, is understanding the connectedness that exists between us and nature. We are not a thing apart. We are inextricably woven into its thread, and its fate is ultimately our fate. The ancient Sufis had a teaching that expressed this well, and I've used it before, I think in the Yale speech I did some years ago. Because you understand one, you think you understand two, because one and one makes two. But you must also understand and. And to me, that's where our moral obligation to the environment happens, in this messy area called and. The balance between nature and man is nothing less than a marriage that cannot be dissolved no matter how hard and how perversely we might try. It is really a sacrament. It's a gift from God, who didn't put us on a dry, lifeless rock, but on a world teeming with beauty and color and life. What we do to it, what we do quite literally to ourselves. And our respect for that fact is nothing less than an expression of our respect for that spark of the divine that exists in us. If that's not a moral imperative, I don't know what is. I'd like to go back to responding a little bit. I jotted down a bunch of notes, and they are scrap pieces here. But I'll try. First of all, particularly today, I don't want to feel as badly as you made it sound, because I was pretty upset this morning. And I think everybody else was. I'm not going to let that get me down. I won't. Secondly, I guess because I have been working on policy with my late husband, and Tim Wirth and Al Gore, and now my husband John Kerry, who, by the way, has announced in January that he would filibuster Anwar, and will, and he will be there. But unfortunately for those of us who toil in those dirty waters of Washington, also have to think of the possibilities and even the idealism that takes us there. Otherwise, you drown. It can be pretty depressing. So, having said that, and I've been a wife of a spouse of a member of Congress and Senate since for almost 30 years. So I've seen Washington for 30 years, close by. And I'm going to tell you a few things that probably will surprise some of you, but I will tell them to you because it's the truth. Going back to Kyoto and the Gore years, Clinton Gore years, Bush years, and I was appointed by President George Senior Bush to the Rio conference as a State Department delegate, and just after my husband died. In a sense, George Bush was gutsier than Clinton and Gore. Clinton and Gore had 8 years to follow George Bush and 92 protocol in Rio, and they did nothing about it. Nothing. And Al Gore was Mr. Environment. He knows the science, and he did nothing. Now, if my husband had been alive, and I don't say that for any reason other than that he brought Al Gore around, understanding the economy and business, the marketplace, to use it, to be able to use that as an instrument to solve problems. Once my husband died, Al did not have that person anymore. And Al worked with my husband, came to, in 1988, 89, to the Amazon, slept in the forest with us and Tim Worth, and we learned a lot of stuff together. But Al, and I know him well, and I say this with sorrow, but also with anger, had 8 years in which to get the CEOs of this country to come in and say, we have something that President Bush has signed. This is a commitment to the world. We have got to define the measures that we can deliver. We, our business leaders, our communities, our country, we have to have a dialogue, come back in 1 year and tell us what you can do. They never did that. I have been working with Paul ONeill for 3 years now, and with Ken Lay, the head of Enron. They came in at the Heinz Center. They both sit on the Global Climate Change Committee with me. And Michael Oppenheimer, whom you know well, and his work, and Bill Merrill, finally, or not finally, but did convince, did show them, proven to both men the reality of global climate change. They are true believers. One of the things we were trying to work on before he was appointed Secretary of Treasury was to bring about the CEOs of this country to do precisely what Clinton Gore should have started 8 years ago. And we've been working on that. And so much so that we got lambasted in the paper this week as a cabal, I guess, the Heinz Center cabal. And tomorrow there will be a very nasty piece from the right wing on Paul ONeill because of this. So they're starting on him. Now, my concern, because of the issue and because I know that Paul and Ken understand the seriousness of this, and they're both CEOs who are used to giving orders and getting things done, it's very hard for them in Washington, excuse me, to deal with the process. It's, I'm sure, very hard for Paul right now to deal with the fact that the president went back on his word. And Christy Whitman must be feeling terrible too. We can't let them down. We've got to be allies to push them and enable them to change things. Not because you want to help any administration, but because it's got to be done, period. It's got to be done. So there are good people. There are good people. I want to go to another question which is parallel with religious education, which is education simply spoken in this country, understanding basic science. When you think of Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan at the same time, both hard conservatives, both getting the same numbers on environmental, global climate change. Maggie Thatcher was a chemist, scientist. She saw it in 2 hours, and she turned the country around. Our country did not. because our president didn't really understand the science. George Bush Sr. saw it, but John Sununu got rid of it because he knew the science. He could kind of distort the truth. Our country and our democracy is led by the people of this country. If the people are not educated, action does not take place in Washington. And when you have a government that cuts back science investment in sciences, and we have school systems that will not allow Darwinism to be talked about, we have a big problem. Education. If we had a literate, conscious population, we would have both religious and political and any kind of response mechanisms, more or less sophisticated, more or less involved, but a natural response. Instead, we don't have the capacity to respond as a whole. And I gave a speech at the request of some scientists about 4 years ago in Seattle to the Interplayers, and they wanted me to talk to the scientists there about their lack of responsibility in translating hard science for the public. So they couldn't do it because they were their colleagues, so I did it. I don't think I'll ever be involved again. But that is true. Science has got to be for both the scientists and the people. We have to, we live in a world that requires science to prove things. We need to know more. We don't have that. As far as The Hague, you talked about Kyoto and The Hague. You'd be happy to know that Paul ONeill, or not happy, Paul ONeill and some others who very much want quick resolution to these problems have a lot of problems with Kyoto, because they think that businesses around the world need to know basically a cost of something, whether it's a cost of a gallon that is going to be the cost for the year, for 6 months, so that they can plan according. Everybody's on the same level playing field. On the other side, scientists and the NGOs say, well, we can't give you that because the Congress will look at that as a tax. And he will say, but we need something to get going. And then if it's not right, we'll correct it up or down. So Kyoto doesn't quite allow for that. Kyoto deals with other things. And Kyoto deals also with mechanisms, the CDMs, which are mechanisms that we could give to developing countries to cope with and do the right thing, so they don't, both in terms of mitigation, remediation, or just startups, be smart from the beginning. Kyoto, unfortunately, has become a football. I know I was in Europe when The Hague was going on, and they called my husband, the U.S. delegation, please, you have to be here, you have to be here. He went. He was the only Democratic senator there. There were 4 Republican senators who were the 4 who wrote this. No, actually, Enzi wasn't, but 2 or 3 of them who wrote the letter to Bush yesterday asking for this. They said at The Hague, yes, there is global climate change, which surprised the dickens out of me. I didn't know they knew that. But they did. But on the other hand, yesterday they said we can't afford this, that, and the other. So there's a lot of confusion. It's really chaotic. The point is, my husband was there for 2 days because he had to go to Vietnam with President Clinton. There were other issues there. I mean, there were issues of the Germans and the French. The French Minister of the Environment loves taxes. She wanted taxes. She doesn't want the Americans to do well because we don't tax. Then the Germans, at the last minute, when the thing was almost resolved, came in and put a completely different plan on the table, which they knew we couldn't take because they resent the U.S., the Germans, and they want comparative advantage. All that does not excuse us, but it's just to say that there's a lot of stuff going on. It was Thanksgiving Wednesday. My husband got in about 11 o'clock at night from The Hague. Things seemed to be well. We were driving to see his mom on Thursday. We got a call from The Hague, from our environmentalists, and some of them were crying on the phone because this thing was going down the drain. It's so complicated, and what I say to people who kind of get an excuse by knocking Kyoto is this is Forget Kyoto. What if there isn't a Kyoto? What would you do? What would you, DuPont, do? What would you so-and-so do? What would you do? Start up. Don't blame. Don't find scapegoats. Start up. Do something. My hope right now, and I know I missed things I wanted to say, but you know that's the way it goes. My hope is that our European cohorts will sign Kyoto without the United States, and that they will embarrass us, and that they will put as much pressure on our president as possible, and I hope we will be embarrassed. That's on the political side of things. I have to tell you that I don't want to divulge anything, but I'm working closely with Paul ONeill in the private sector right now to still bring about what we're trying to do, irrespective of what the president is saying. So that's still going on. There was something I wanted to say here quickly. Oh, I know. I've said this at one of the Harvard campus environmental committee before. And these are kind of revolutionary things from people who don't want to hear them, but they're not really, they're common sense. One thing is that I think this university, along with some of the other big universities in the country, not only have an obligation, but they have a tremendous opportunity to set standards for the incoming kids who apply here, who apply to Wisconsin, who apply to Yale, who apply to Penn, who apply to anywhere, which is you must have, and I'll put my dictator's hat on, you must have, or my steward on the horse, you must have a semester or 2 summers worth of public service in your community. You must have a semester worth or 2 summers worth of environmental studies, or not studies, work. You know, whether it's your landfill in your place, whether it is garbage, I don't care what it is. Something, write an essay with your application and the proof that you've done it. You must have an environmental course in high school that is, you know, an accredited course for anybody applying to these schools. That's easy to do. Imagine what a revolution that would be in this country for every child who wants to apply to these universities. And if you could get, say, 30 private schools and 30 or 20 public schools to do that. At the university campus setting, I will give you an example of what can be done, and it cannot be done in this university because of the way this university works, which is not like anybody else. But I had John Holdren come to Pitt with von Weizsäcker from Germany at the request of the chancellor. They were going to, the faculty had asked if I would get together somebody really great to talk to them about the environment. And you know John Holdren, who he is. He's you know, one of the great geniuses on energy, environment, and international security. He received the Nobel Prize on behalf of Pugwash. He's at the Kennedy School as well as at the university, teaching economics. He's brilliant and wonderful. And he went. I couldn't be there, but one of my environmental people was there. Out of that meeting at Pitt, the faculty voted to add 3 more law professors to their faculty. There's 1 at the Harvard Law School. They added a must course for every single engineering, not a course, an understanding of those things for every single engineering student, a school-wide obligatory course on environment. And this is only little Pitt, right? They did that out of 1 visit from von Weizsäcker and John Holdren. So good things can happen. I think this university should have mandatory courses on environmental science, at least 1 good broad course for every student. And I think, and I disagree with Mike McElroy, because I've been working with these people at Harvard on this major that they finally did. They've made a major that I couldn't have taken. It's a pre-med major with 1 course difference. And interesting, the people from the outside that kicked off this whole environmental thing at Harvard, I was one of them, none of them were math, calculus, physics students, but they were the ones who were here. And Mike McElroy, whom I respect very much as an astrophysicist and who cares about this issue, looks at it only from the point of view of math, physics, and he's very proud that the best students coming to Harvard are majoring in this. But gosh, only doctors can be environmentalists? No. And there isn't a broad course. It's wrong. It's elitist. It's wrong. And it's blind. And I've told them that. The last thing I would say, and this is something where the school can do something, the kids, the teachers. We had the Sullivan Principles dealing with South African apartheid. I was involved in those things back then. We should have principles today that make the vestiture in this university and all the responsible universities of all noxious, foul companies, and they are known, and we should have an absolute determination to help the ones that are really struggling to make a go of it, and they are some. That's how I invest my own stuff. And the university has an absolute obligation to do that. And they haven't done it. No excuse. So those are very simple, very clear signs that times are changing. And I hope you all can do something about it.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a rich display of comments and thoughts on a very, very challenging subject. We, I think, can go for, we started a little bit late. Let's give ourselves 15 or 20 minutes for questions and comments. Could you please identify yourselves and also, under the constraints of time, make your questions precise, brief, and perhaps comments as well, if you please. Yes, ma'am. Oh, hang on and just wait for the microphone, if you please. Thanks.
My name is Betty Ann Donnelly, and my dissertation research is on the Jubilee 2000 campaign and the role of churches in trying to get debt reduction for the poorest countries. And I was very intrigued by the way that you presented the issue of the environment as not a self-interested one. And as I look at the coalition of NGOs that have worked vis-a-vis the World Bank and the IMF on poverty reduction issues, I want you to speak a little bit more about the compatibility or conflict between poverty reduction and environmental protection as international values. Because when I interview some of the anti-poverty groups in Washington, they would speak disparagingly of the enviros as if you're concerned about lifestyle for people in the U.S. to be able to go reefing. You know, so I wanted to. How much have you seen an improvement in the relationship between the environmental movement and the poverty reduction movement?
Oh, sure, Bob. Let me just say quickly that I think that it's only just beginning, and that there's a deep suspicion within the work, people who do international relief work and so on and so forth, that the environment is somehow some sort of extra that you worry about once you know, instead of being the thing that allows people to have food on their tables and indeed tables and houses to begin with. It's beginning to change. Christian Aid, the biggest UK charity, did something I thought was really important last year. They said they were no longer going to refer to things as natural disasters. Because there aren't, with the exception of volcanoes and earthquakes, there no longer are natural disasters. We have our hand in everything. In fact, some of us were, the sort of slogan that we were proposing for, you know, hurricanes and things in this country was, it's not an act of God, it's an act of Congress, you know. And as that realization spreads, hopefully these networks will get much tighter, because we're talking about the furthest thing from an extra. We're talking about the thing that, I mean, there's not enough relief aid in all the world to deal with what's coming down the pike if we don't get climate under control. 1998, the warmest year on record, 300 million human beings, 1 in 20, were flooded out of their homes for a week, a month, in some cases forever.
Just on the hurricane thing, I don't remember where the idea came from, but I still would love to see this happen, which is that we stop naming hurricanes after people and we start naming them after, actually after companies that cause climate change. So it'd be, Hurricane Exxon devastated Honduras today. It's not that crazy an idea. We could explore it. This is a very, very complicated issue. One reason it's complicated is that who speaks for whom. If you go to an international trade forum like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, what you will hear is leaders of developing countries saying, we need to develop and we don't want you to impose environmental or labor practices as unfair trade barriers. And so then, well, they are the heads of countries, and you can view each one of them in terms of the degree of legitimacy. I personally don't view the leader of Myanmar or Burma as being someone who speaks for the people of Burma. But when you actually go to the countries themselves, they often repudiate that position. In other words, they say, no, look, these are people at the top who just want to maximize trade and they're willing to get it at any price. Kenya is about to experience the devastation of its coast because of a relationship that the Kenyan dictator has worked out with a Canadian mining company, basically to devastate the Canadian coast in order to construct a titanium mine. And the people in the NGOs and the community there do not want development at that price, the destruction of the coast of Kenya. And yet if you talk to the Kenyan government, they say this is essential for our people. In a place like India, there is an incredibly deep-rooted understanding that the quality of human life is inseparably connected, and that is that you need both clean water and gainful employment, and that this split, oh, we can do relief work but not think about the environment, is sort of like saying, well, we can do relief work but not worry about fundamental issues of human health. It's just ridiculous. The whole concept of sustainability, which is alien to Americans and absent from our political discussion and mostly absent from our teaching, is in fact all about the integration of these questions. And one of the reasons that I'm not happy about religious, I mean, look, Jubilee is a great thing, but this notion is based on some very old and, in my view, paternalistic ideas that let's get people money and then they'll be able to do some things. Debt relief is absolutely critical. It's a no-brainer. But again, it's this mentality of, well, this or that. And the other thing I just want to say, which I really didn't get a chance to say, is that I would like to see Teresa, by the way, who has been an unbelievable leader in this field for a long time, and I think, she's very modest about this, but if you know the public record and the private record, Teresa has been raising these issues for just about longer than anyone. But one of the things that we have gotten ourselves into as a nation, which is ridiculous and insulting and pathetic, is that we have gotten to a point where we think of, to be smart, we have to talk about why something can't happen. I mean, we talk about, well, that won't happen, and this can't happen, and that's not it. And sort of skepticism begins to infect our sense of the possible. And so you go around the world and you see people doing unbelievable things with tiny resources, believing that they can change the world. And we over here have this sluggish, sanctimonious, ridiculous view that, well, we don't have enough, and it'll never work anyway, and why even bother? Yeah, that is sad. And we should not, what we should be talking about and teaching about are examples where people started with nothing and changed everything. And there are hundreds of them, but we're not taught to talk about that. We're not taught, we don't teach about it. We don't have examples. And I'll tell you something, one of the things that I did have the privilege to do when I was here is that we don't teach people how to make change. There's lots of things that you can do all across the board, and yet it's all about how it's never going to happen. You have to have the policy, you have to do the research, and you have to, so, it's a little bit of a digression from the question, but But go to the Center for Science and the Environment in India's website. Wonderful website. They go to the heart of this issue. They see this as integrally related, and they have wonderful stuff about it. And people who try to divide it, I think, are falsely dividing this question.
Which website is that?
I think it's CSE. Oh, God, I can't remember. But just put in Center, spelled in the British way, for Science in the Environment India, and ask to be on their email distribution list. It's absolutely fabulous group of people, and they are filled with the sense of possibility in a country that has 1.1 billion people, and yet they think that they can turn it around. So we should be ashamed that we don't think we can do it here.
Yes, sir.
I got a question about...
Whoops, hang on.
My name's Ambrose Spencer, and I've done some teaching and consulting on environmental design. We can look at business as usual. Structural reform of defects and structural dysfunction, those have been identified by ecological economics. And then there's finally the possibility of recognizing the challenge that's in front of us and going back and looking at what Hammurabi did in Mesopotamia and what Moses did. We got to take a look at what we got to get to, where we come from, where we are and the road we got to travel, and recognize that the law is controlling a lot of stupid decisions, and we got to rewrite law from the basis up again. We may have to rewrite it so that we don't have ownership anymore, where it's a contracted stewardship, where ownership is a privilege rewarded on the basis of ownership, and that equity is a fundamental profit and value within culture. It ought to be built into the law at the base. Good. And my question is, where in the world are people studying what this systemic replacement of the structurally dysfunctional and defective legal system that we use in the world that guides the game and the rules that we make decisions by? Where is that work being done? Is it being done here?
Thank you. Any responses?
Well, it's a huge and it's a great area because just two very quick things. The chartering of corporations is an ancient practice, rose in the 18th, 19th century with specific understandings. I think it would be a great thing, and some people are trying to do, to review the nature, the legal structure on which our entire immense corporate structure depends. And I think it would be a very fertile debate. Even if we end back where we are, it's a very fertile debate to have because it'll stimulate thinking. The other thing is the whole boundary of what ownership is and who's responsible is changing. Extended product liability, life cycle analysis, the tagging of chemical products so that once you make them, you're responsible for them, so that you then lease them rather than sell them. The whole notion of selling and leasing and service and product are all changing right now, and that's exciting because there are many good things that can happen out of that. But as any abstract theoretical economist will tell you, you can't have markets until you define ownership boundaries. It's absolutely, you can't exchange anything until you know who owns it. And the whole idea of what it is to own something is changing. It's a huge area, but you need to ask very blunt questions, just as you're doing. But a lot more of them.
Bill or Teresa? No. I'm afraid I've been enjoined that we must terminate by a higher power here. I am sorry. It's obvious that many people would like to continue the discussion, as we all would, but time has interfered. We are going to have a reception in Rockefeller, which is just down the hallway and across the open plaza there. And we're all here are invited, and that'll give you a chance perhaps to engage our speakers at closer range. Thank you all for coming, and thanks so much to our speakers.